something big. Watch your back.
The original Dead Space is a video games classic, and a horror story fondly remembered by many. The tale of one engineer fighting to survive within the gloomy, corpse-filled corridors of a dead mining ship left a lasting impression. And so when it came to the remake, developer EA Motive has been careful in how it approached the narrative. But there are some changes. Just like the remake looks different, it's also scripted differently. That's because all teams working on Dead Space had the same goal.
Overall, it was to give the narrative the same kind of glow up that everything else had had. As a player, what you want is you want to have the same feeling again, feel like you're playing it for the first time. It was looking at how do we tell this story for people who are newcomers to the series, but for veteran players as well, we wanted to give them a little bit of a surprise of like, oh, this is a little different. You change that direction very slightly and it can take you to a very different place.
The first significant change you're likely to notice is that Isaac Clarke can now speak.
But 6 months apart with only vid calls, it's rough. Easy to say the wrong thing.
The once silent protagonist now has a full script, and will chat with both other characters and himself.
Nicole, it's me.
To ensure Isaac's new dialogue was as authentic as possible, EA Motive looked at other games in the series in which the character has a voice.
Because it's the closest sort of emotional reference that we have, there was a lot of looking at Dead Space 2, and sort of looking at key scenes of, how does he react in this moment? What's his sense of humor like? How does he react under pressure, like verbally?
Ishimura's overrun with... they're fucking monsters.
And it was just trying to get that personality correct, trying to make sure that he feels like Isaac, he doesn't feel like another character. Isaac is this, very smart, savvy guy. He's got empathy for the people around him. He's got like salty language, and he's pretty fun to write actually.
Rewriting Dead Space's script offered the writers a chance to improve upon the original storytelling. One of the elements the team wanted to better emphasize was the cult-like Church of Unitology, which is introduced relatively late into the original game. In the remake, characters begin discussing the church much earlier, which lays the groundwork for its significant role later in the story.
The marker must be delivered to the church, whatever the cost.
What I didn't want to do is write Dead Space where Isaac's like, what's the Church of Unitology? I'll go along with them, I'll trust them, because every veteran player is screaming not to trust Unitologists. So then you end up with a situation at the beginning of like, Isaac's like, yeah, I hate the Church of Unitology. And then people who are new to the series might be like, okay, what's Unitology? That's interesting. Veterans would be like, why does he hate Unitology at this point? And then kind of unraveling that mystery of why he has that relationship to the church and what their kind of philosophy is and why he's so hostile to the idea.
That marker, that's the symbol of the Church of Unitology.
It didn't take you for a believer, Isaac.
My mother was. But if they found this on some alien planet, what does that mean?
That Unitology's onto something?
Unitology's full of shit.
It personalizes it, and I think that was something that was, kind of a theme going through the script, making everything personal.
The effort to make everything personal has meant that some scenarios from the original game have been expanded into new, more emotional storylines. Chen, once merely an NPC that was killed in the game's opening, is now a more important character who demonstrates the true horror of the necromorphs.
The transformation of Chen makes the necromorph transition very personal to the crew. All of this is in the original game. It's just trying to find those moments and polishing them, just bringing them out just a little bit more. All of these seeds are there, it's just helping them flower.
Dead Space's script is not the only thing that pushes forward the narrative. The environment is equally important, and so the hallways, rooms, and decks of the Ishimura spaceship were all designed to tell a story. In the remake, the power of modern-day consoles and PCs has allowed EA Motive to improve upon the original game's excellent environmental storytelling.
A lot of the original design of the game took a lot of themes from Gothic motifs, Gothic architecture, as well as a lot of like repeated skeletal structures. So that's where you see like the repeated ribbing across the entire thing that was meant to evoke a bit of a feeling of like being inside of a creature or of a skeleton. The Ishimura itself is frequently referred to as like a living entity, as though it's some being that you are inside, and that the Ishimura is sick and it's dying, and that's what you are partially there to try and help.
We went back, looked at every location and concepted, and our challenge was, how can we bring a lot more life to these environments? How can we make it feel like the crew that lived there made that their actual day-to-day space? you look at Nicole's office, for example, there's a lot more props and things that talks a little bit more about what she does. If you go into medical areas, it feels more like an actual medical deck than just a generic space, for example.
Look at his wounds. We can't handle so many trauma cases, and the command crew won't tell us what's happening.
Dead Space had so many labels, posters, signs. A lot of the stuff in the original game was so low resolution, you couldn't actually read what was on there. That's the sort of stuff you have to consider now. Like, you put a warning label on the wall, like you can walk up to it and read like all the individual steps.
You know, at one point I worked with our artist. They were like, we have all these papers for the marker about unitology, and the original you can't read them because they're too low res at this point. What text do you want on here? Trying to think about that because, you know, people have got 4K monitors, high res stuff, they can read all this stuff. So it's trying to make sure that when there's text that you can read, it kind of makes sense.
On your journey through the Ishimura, you'll find a variety of diaries and audio logs, many of which you may recognise from your original quest through the ship.
Quite a few of them are very similar or verbatim. We do have some new ones. We do have side quests in the game, some of which use those audio logs and text logs to tell that story. But some of them have actually been translated into AR.
What are you so worried about? The marker is defined.
For example, in the original game, when you go into medical, there's a video log you can pick up from Nicole. When we were looking at that, this seemed like a great candidate for an AR scene where we actually see Nicole trying to save a patient.
This is Senior Medical Officer Nicole Brennan. Medical is overwhelmed. We need help.
Again, just personalizing it and bringing it out into that moment. And creating this atmosphere as well. You know, it's almost ghostly seeing these AR figures around the ship.
Unlike the Final Fantasy VII remake, Dead Space is not trying to completely reinvent itself. EA Motive's approach to story is much more akin to that taken by Capcom for Resident Evil 2. It's an updated, polished take on a story that players know and love. And from what we've seen so far, it promises to make the horror classic just that little bit better. For more Dead Space, check out how the developers have recreated its iconic guns, and our comparison between the remake and the original game. And for everything else, stick with IGN.